Okay, welcome back to the Breaking Bread Village. Today we are going to talk about the normalization of violence against women. This one is entitled, this one is titled, excuse me, What Was She Wearing? But what was she wearing? That's something that we hear a lot of times when women are victimized, when they're assaulted. People ask the question, but what was she wearing? Which places the blame on her. So today we're going to have a conversation about that. Typically, we do have an annual sexual assault awareness um, event, and it was canceled, of course, this year due to the COVID-19. So we were unable to have it, but I still want to have the conversation. So we're going to do that today, and I'm really excited about this. Not that this is a happy conversation or a joyous conversation, but I'm really happy about being able to have the conversation, bring awareness, and give people some hope. I think that's important and just shed a little bit of light. So I'm going to invite everybody on right now. First, I'm going to invite Miss Jennifer. Hello, Jennifer.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course. So Jennifer is a historian. So she's going to kind of come from that aspect. She has studied a lot of history, and we're going to talk a little bit about how this has been something that has been normalized since the beginning of time. So we're going to talk about that. Let me add Jen on. Hey, Jen.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Awesome. I thank you both for being here. And Jen is a sexual, what's the actual title? I want to make sure I say it right.
I am a sexual assault specialist and a assistant prosecuting attorney. So I just prosecute sex crimes.
Gotcha. And you've been doing this since 1995.
Yes.
That was when you had your first,
Long
when you tried
time.
your first case. Wow. That's a long time, and I appreciate that, putting that work on, because I know even when I used to work with children, some of the stories that you hear can be very. It just kind of consumes you. So to be doing it for so long, I mean, it has to be a passion of yours and truly a fight. So I appreciate that. Let me invite Ms. Beanpay on. Hello, how are you?
I'm doing good.
Awesome. So Bimpe is Nigerian American, and she's going to kind of just talk about some religious and cultural aspects that can contribute to the mindset of how women are the problem, so to speak, as opposed to the actual system and the mindset of people victimizing women, and not it's not our fault. And I think that people have been made to believe that. Because of, since, as I talked about earlier, since the beginning of time, we've been made to believe that it's our fault. And I think I was even speaking to Jennifer a little earlier before we all got on, how sometimes women, we're so much to blame too, as blaming the woman as well. Especially, if you're very conservative and you dress, with the, pinned up all the way up to your, chin, and somebody else dresses a little bit more provocative, quote unquote, or revealing. We have a tendency to blame the woman for her abuse that she experienced. So we want to kind of talk about that. So first, I'm going to allow Jennifer to kind of talk a little bit about the history. And of course, we know it's been since the beginning of time. So we will be here for weeks talking about the history of women being assaulted and victimized violently, and not being really avenged. But I just want Jennifer to kind of touch base on some different instances in time to just kind of capture the essence of how this has been something that's been going on for forever. So this is not new that women are being blamed for their own pains. So go ahead, Jennifer, if you want to start there.
Sure. Yeah. And right. Like I could talk about this forever, but I'll just do like some snapshots to like walk us through history. A historian that specializes in women and gender studies pointed out, her name's Sharon Block, and she points out that like there's been sexual assault against women and the records of it since we started keeping records as humans. It's just that prolific and that old. But what we know about a lot of the older sexual assaults are what the men wanted to tell us about it. And what mattered was how it affected the men. So we have to learn to read through all of that to find out what happened for the women. if you go all the way back to, I mean, you know, we can go back to Livy in the 1st century, and he's writing about the founding of Rome. And it's a celebratory story about how Romulus invited the Sabine tribe to a religious festival, and then he killed all the men, kidnapped the women, and they raped them. And then the women could, you know, bring about peace by having the Romans babies and founding the new empire. So, I mean, we've been talking about this forever, and women have been negotiating their survival forever. We have stories from diaries from those who went with Columbus on his voyage, and torturing and raping indigenous women as just part of their practice, and then calling them harlots after, you know, being beaten into submission and raped. Then they were told that they were the harlots for having sex. So that's just been part and parcel of our history for so long, and we can carry that, you know, all the way up through. You know, in the progressive era in the United States, women were fighting to raise the age of consent from 10 years old to 14. And this was a big, big deal. So a man could do whatever he wanted with a girl as young as 10 years old for a very, very long time. And of course, women who were enslaved were considered property. And they could be raped with impunity by their white masters. And if anybody else raped those women, it was considered property damage against the white slaveholder.
Wow.
So this is a long history, and it's a worldwide history, and it's still, you know, we can carry it up to today. You know, which Jen can speak even more about. But, you know, I think about somebody like Brock Turner and, you know, his sentencing being because what about him? What's going to happen to his life?
Right.
But all of that, when we talk about these things that are happening today, it's part of a long history that devalues women's place, oftentimes considered her property, and not a full autonomous human being. And so we've been doing this for a very, very long time.
Which is still happening today. I mean, even in regards to like marriage. I mean, when you think about marriage, sometimes some men still in society still see women as the property of the male, you know, and that he can kind of do whatever he wants to do within that marriage. You know, I've spoke with women who have been raped inside their marriages. And, you know, sometimes they have been taught that, well, you know, he's your husband, so he can do what he wants. And that's something that we have to stop teaching to our girls, to our women, and to our boys and our men. We have to stop teaching that, you know, we have to show some, I am big on accountability, and I am big on, you know, checking yourself, right? And we have to start making people do that a little bit more. So you talked about all around the world Bimpe. I want you to kind of tell me just a little bit in regards to, because we know that this is not just an American thing. This is globally, right? We've seen, you know, I know I've watched videos of women being mutilated in their private areas, you know, so that men can be more satisfied, you know, you know, so this whole violence against women has been something that's all over the world. What do you feel in regards to the connection between religion, culture, and this epidemic that we have going on in regards to treatment of women when it comes to sexual violence?
Well, just a little bit about me. So I was born and raised in Houston, Texas for the majority of my life. And then I lived in Nigeria for 2 years when I was a teenager. And it's interesting because in that period of, you know, it may have changed. I'm not as closely associated with the evangelical church as I was when I grew up. But even before I went to Nigeria, the mindset was that you had to dress in order to protect the man from having lustful thoughts. Yeah, so we were the garters of men's thoughts and actions. So even as me, the personal experiences I went through, I never felt the bonus to say, "Hey, this happened to me," because if something happened to you, well, you caused it. There was some action you did that brought that type of behavior on. So then, of course, when I went to Nigeria when I was a teenager, I would say that mindset was even more intense. And then you bring in all the influences of culture, where Nigerian culture is very patriarchal, very men first. Women still to this day struggle with women's rights much more than women do in the Western world, where it's just seen as what were you doing there? Obviously you were wearing something that you weren't supposed to. I remember hearing about the beauty competitions that they were having at universities there, and the person I was speaking with, he was saying, "Oh, those competitions are bad," and I was like, I asked why are they bad? Oh, because many of them get raped. And I'm thinking, okay, well, that's not so having a pageant is the cause of rape, not rape in of itself, not patriarchal views, not men thinking that they can just take whatever they want. So definitely that mindset was what was implanted into me growing up, and it took many years to break that. And like I was saying, even in Nigeria, women's rights is still a huge issue that has not been properly resolved. Just recently, this past week, there's a story of a 22-year-old college student who went to her church to study because there are no public libraries around where she lives, and she was raped and murdered in that church. And I'm as a lot of things are going on right now, and a lot of people have different opinions. I'm trying to keep a very streamlined of what I take in, because some of the comments I'm seeing on Twitter about, well, she shouldn't have. What was she really doing in the church? And well, what was she wearing? And then saying, if a man wants to have sex with you, just give him sex. Don't fight it. Just
oh
give
my
him
goodness.
sex. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in regards to equality. When I'm seeing the overall evangelical church worldwide, I feel here in America, like I said, I'm not as involved as I used to be, but I feel like that mindset is changing. We are starting to see a mindset change in the evangelical church when it comes to how women should dress, and whether or not they're the garters of men's thoughts and of their purity. So I am seeing that mindset change, and even in Nigeria, I am seeing people speak up and saying this is not right. This should not be tolerated. We need to change the way that we think about sexual assault. We think about women's rights.
Right. Wow. What do you guys think about that, Jennifer? Wow. I mean, it's just mind-boggling to me that just the whole concept of women having to have that burden to bear that if he can't control himself, it must be my fault, and I mean, I can't imagine it. I mean, I know it's a mindset that we have here too, of course, but I've never really had that directly impacted, on my life, so to speak. I mean, we've all thought it, but what do you guys think about that? What she just shared?
Well, I have 3 daughters and 2 sons, and my daughters have all been dress coded.
Mm-hmm.
They have been dress coded over and over and over again for wearing nothing different than what the boys wear to school.
Right.
But they're held responsible even here in our public schools in Michigan for, the stretch pants that incite the riot with the boys, or the, crop top that shows a little bit of your belly button. And, I have fought for my girls, not surprisingly, but for them to, be able to express themselves how they'd like to express themselves the same way that my boys are able to. So there's that cultural piece of it is still very much alive, very much alive. And I fight with juries every single time I try a case. I start by during the process of voir dire, I have to educate the jury, let them know that the rape myths that they carry are no longer appropriate. And you start by laying that down for them, so that when those things start to come out of the defense attorney's mouth, or those thoughts start rolling around in the back of the jury room when they're deliberating, they know to shoot them down, because we've talked about them already, that they're not correct, and they're no longer appropriate.
Right.
Yeah, those dress code things jumped right into my head too. But if we want to do a historical example just of the same types of attitudes, We can go back to colonial America. The proprietary governor of Virginia, let me get his name right, Baron Frederick Calvert, was accused of kidnapping and raping a local milliner named Sarah Woodcock. And the jury took 1 hour to decide that it was Sarah's fault because she didn't fight hard enough. So she apparently wanted.
Wow. Wow.
And that ruined, Sarah's reputation, and she takes all the blame. The only long-term impact he had was eventually the UK stripped him of his title. So I guess that's something. But yeah, the burden is very often placed on the woman. Like, she should have stopped it.
And we're fighting hard enough. Go ahead, Jen.
And it cuts both ways, because if you fight really hard, you may get killed.
Right.
This is something that we have been taught. If you fight really hard, you may get killed. So we run around thinking that we are in danger if we fight for our own lives. And so just like, you're supposed to relax and take it, right? This is what the myth is, and the myth is, it's terrible, but
it's true.
If you internalize that myth, and then you are in a situation where you're being sexually assaulted and you do nothing, or you freeze because of tonic immobility and the chemical dump in your system drops to the point where you can't do a thing, then you will have the jury judging you for doing nothing.
So like you just can't win.
No matter what you do. And that's why it's so important to what you're doing here tonight, and having this discussion all throughout the community as often as possible, because we need to continue to educate not just the women, but the men that, we are not the bearer of responsibility here. And it is not our fault because we decided to go to church, or because we decided to go for a walk by ourselves and it was, late. And I got to tell you, I've had a million cases, and I can tell you a bunch of stories where it did come down to wardrobe. Which, the topic of tonight is, what was she wearing? And that's asked even now all the time. I had one case where it came down to the underwear, that if she didn't want it, she wouldn't have been wearing that underwear.
Oh, right? Wow.
And so in closing argument, I brought my entire underwear drawer out and I dumped it on the railing.
Yeah.
What does this say about me? This is my underwear. What does this say about me?
Right.
And I made them think about that from a different perspective, but it's unbelievably complicated to get people to look at it differently than they've been taught. And you have basically 5 days to try to change their minds about everything.
Wow.
So how do we fight this? And that's the thing, is that it's so ingrained. And like I said, even in us as women, sometimes we too fault women at times, for what they had on, or their work, what type of work they do, especially sometimes in the church. I've seen where a woman gets pregnant before, and this is not necessarily with the sexual assault part, but this is just the mindset where a woman gets pregnant. She, of course, shows her pregnancy, right? So, back in the day, you'd have to stand before the church and apologize that you did this great sin. And then, you're paraded around and you can't participate in different functions within the church because you were the sinner. But the male is not held to the same sin. He's able to still do what he wants to do. And, but it's like it was an equal playing ground, right? I mean, on that part of it. So for me, it's just the mindset of it, this ingrained mindset that we have, that the women are responsible for. And I'll just say it, weak men. Like, if you're weak and you can't handle yourself, that's not my problem. You know what I mean? And, people can take that how they want, but it's just the truth. I just have always found it very interesting that we are held responsible for somebody else not being able to control themselves. I'm like, especially when you're taught that men are so strong and so, all these different things that we're taught in regards to the male species. And then I'm saying you can't control yourself though. Are you that powerless that you can't control your thoughts, your body? So I mean, how do you guys think we combat this? How do we change the narrative?
I think we have to talk about it in terms of that, like you're talking about this, men are perceived as strong, but it's really about a power dynamic, and it always has been, and it's always been about control and
Yes.
maintaining control. And it's part and parcel with maintaining patriarchy worldwide. You know, as Bimpe mentioned when she was talking about evangelicals, but it's not just evangelicals, and it is part of this power and domination story. And I think that we have to educate from that perspective as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's important to start. I mean, to start as young as possible, even with just to start as young as possible and as close as possible. So the men that are closest to you, like for instance, with my former roommate, she had a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old boy, and you know, we may, and I was telling her, you know, we have to teach them young that, you know, women are not, you know, they're slaves. Women are not. We're entitled to our own bodily autonomy. Like it's not okay if you just want to, you know, even if they're little boys, there may not be like any viciousness behind it. We have to teach them young that, you know, you need to have boundaries when it comes to, you know, everyone's own body, and especially with women, because when they grow up, like for instance, I would say even with hugs, and some people may disagree with me on this, but I never. You know, of course, you see little kids, and you may know the parents. And you're like, "Oh, give me a hug." I don't like when parents try, like they're like, "Oh, give her a hug. That's my friend. That's your auntie." But if they don't want to give me a hug, that they're learning how to have, you know, to set boundaries and say no. Like I don't want to give that person a hug. And then even with little boys too, if you're telling them, "Oh, give her a hug," then you're teaching them like, "Oh, well, okay, I have to do something I don't want to do, so that means somebody else can do what they don't want to do."
No, that's really a good point. I agree with that. And you know, I'm a hugger. Anybody knows me knows I am a hugger. So I will go in before the person realizes it's happening, and I've got you, right? So I understand that, and I remember when my kids were younger, I would, you know, because it was this idea for me, like, you know, for them to be able to learn how to show love, right, or show appreciation. But as I got older, I understand what you're saying, and I got it. I'm like, oh wow, we are kind of subconsciously teaching them that, you know, we can force them into allowing someone to touch them, or them to touch someone else against what they feel, right? So they don't feel comfortable, because I believe kids can gauge, you know, the spirit in a person. You know, I'm a firm believer in that. And if they feel weird about it, we should honor that. But we don't all the time. And I agree with what you're saying. And I, you know, the stuff that I learned now, that I know now, of course, I wish I knew when my children were younger, because I would have done things, you know, differently for sure. Did you guys have anything to say about that, Jennifer or Jen?
Well, I definitely think, you know, I go through that with my kids too. And my poor children who are probably watching this right now, I've heard every, you know, from the time they were little tiny people, I've been on high alert, you know, and so they have heard stories that maybe were not the greatest stories for children to hear, but I've always told them in the context of, you know, how do you advocate for yourself and others, and how do you make sure that when you know, something is happening and you know that it's wrong, that you're a person who speaks up. And, you know, how do you recognize that your own strength in situations where it feels like you're being oppressed? And I think that they are stronger having been raised by a mother who, you know, beat this into their head. But I think that's, you know, that's what it takes with just like you said, Bimpe, you have to start at such an early age, because then it's ingrained in who you are, and it's not something that you have to change your fabric for, you know, when you come around to your own way of thinking.
Right. Very true. So Jennifer, I know earlier we were kind of discussing some things, and I know you spoke about kind of Rosa Parks and her journey. Can you tell me a little bit more about it? Because I found it very interesting, because I didn't know.
Yeah, so it's kind of an empowering story. I mean, we all know about Rosa Parks sitting on the bus and all of that, but long before that, in the 1940s, Rosa Parks' first assignment with the NAACP was actually as a sexual assault investigator. And so she was doing that work out of Montgomery, Alabama, and traveling around Alabama to both protect Black men from false accusations that would lead to lynchings, but also to try to seek justice for Black women who often had no form of justice. it's important to remember that coming from the tradition of slavery, like Jim Crow, there was still this stereotype of the Black Jezebel, and that she wasn't really rapeable because she was so insatiable anyway, that she always wanted it, so you couldn't really rape her. So this mentality still existed in the Jim Crow South. And there was a rape that Rosa Parks made famous, and some people know Reese Taylor's story now. I think Oprah brought to light that history for a public audience. But so Rosa Parks goes to meet with Reese Taylor to find out what happens. She was kidnapped and raped by 6 white men repeatedly on her way home from church. 2 all white juries refused to indict any of the men, even though they said, yeah, we did it. The sheriff knew when Rosa Parks came to interview Reese. The sheriff drove around to intimidate her, and then finally entered the Taylor's home and told her that we don't want troublemakers here. And so she left there and went back to Montgomery and started a national campaign for justice for Reese Taylor, and worked to publicize this. Unfortunately, she never was able to truly achieve justice for Reese. But I do think it's this empowering story that this was, a woman standing up for a woman, and this led to a very active and important human rights activism on behalf of, Rosa Parks that we know today. She's so much more interesting and complicated than just sitting down on a bus.
Yes, no, I appreciate you saying that, because I did not know that she helped kind of spearhead that. That's really interesting. No, so I appreciate that, because she was way more than just that, and I think that she has been kind of minimized to that. So wow. So Jen, I want you to tell me a little bit about and again, I know that you are, a prosecuting attorney, so you can't really go into a lot of detail on some things, but just share, maybe a story or so that really sticks out to you that really kind of motivated you to keep going. We all have, whenever you're out there doing the work, I call it, whenever you're out there doing the work, there's always a story that motivates you to keep going. You always, I know we're working with children. There's some stories that I'm just like, this is why I do it. This is why I have to keep doing it. So give me a story that may stick out to you that you feel that strongly about,
Well, I have had so many cases where the victim, I watch the victims become survivors and then become advocates for other women. And I think those are always the cases that really touch your heart, because that's how I came into this too. I was a victim, and then I was an advocate, and then I was a lawyer, and then I was a prosecutor of sex crimes. And I think that oftentimes that's the path that people find into sex crimes work, because they have been victimized and they look for a path that helps them treat others the way that they weren't treated. I mean, that's certainly what happened for me, that I sat across from an officer, and I told my story, and I did the best I could to give as much detail as I could. And I still had my clothes. I had all these things, like, I have everything. This is what you need. Right.
Right.
And he sat down, and he kind of threw a notebook across the table at me, and he said, now, what the fuck happened? I don't know if I can say that on your show.
No, say things. Just do like this next time. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead.
Happened. And it was hostile. It was hostile. And so I was taken aback, and he was a very big man. And so I was taken aback just by the way that he was physically intimidating me.
Right, posturing, yeah.
And then I'm still trying to tell my story as best as I can, and I get to the end of it, and he says, well, this can go one of two ways. Either we can go and we can interview him and we can ruin his life, or we can just file this away, and if he ever does it again, then you'll be a witness for the next person.
Oh my goodness.
And I said, okay, file it away, because I had been beaten up for an hour and a half and not believed for an hour and a half. And I'd had enough. But I left that room.
Yeah.
And I said, and it changed my path completely. I was determined that no one would ever, do it that way again, that I would train officers, that I would learn every victim-centered trauma-informed approach that I possibly could, that I would bring those into the courtroom, I would bring it into jury selection. Everything I did would have an emphasis on that exact thing, that we're victim-centered, we're trauma-informed, and we're defendant-focused in terms of our prosecutions.
Yeah. Well, what really stood out to me with that, Gina, too, is how the burden was put on you that you were going to ruin his life based on his choices and his actions. That says so much. That says a lot.
I was 18 years old, and I'd lived a very sheltered little life in Livonia. So I didn't want to ruin anybody's life.
Right. Well, who would? It's like, oh my goodness. And then you start to feel shamed. You start to question yourself. You start to question sometimes even the accounts of what happened. You start to question so much because it's like, well, did it really happen like that? Did I kind of, I know for myself, I will share this story. When I was probably, I don't know, 14. So I'm going to tell, if my mother is listening, this is one of my stories that she told me that I wasn't supposed to. She doesn't want to hear any of the things that I snuck and did when I was young. Just take that to the grave. But when I was, about 14 years old, I snuck a boy in the house. You sneak a boy in the house, and mom was out to work. I was one of those latchkey kids, so mom is working, single parent. I'm at home. Snuck a boy in the house, and we wanted to make out, right? You do a little kissing and that, kind of like pushing up against each other, but that's as far as it was. That was what we kind of discussed and planned out. And I remember, we were there, and he started to get a lot more aggressive and a lot more, kind of demanding, and started to do things that I did not want him to do. And I remember having so much fear because I literally could not overpower him, right? He was stronger than me. And then when you couple fear with it, right, then that just becomes even more demobilizing. So and at that moment, I'm like, you're thinking kind of like, this is happening right now. And what am I to do? Nobody was there to help me, right? Hear me scream, and eventually my fighting and kind of, screaming a bit caused him to second guess, and he left. But I always hold on to that. So I never experienced an actual invasion, so to speak, of my body. But I remember being in that situation and saying, someone could easily say, well, you invited him in the house, right? Well, you guys discussed, making out, so to speak, so putting that blame on you. And I remember being scared about that and thinking, wow, wonder if that went to where he was trying to get it to go, I would be at fault. That was my fear, right? Because I was, first of all, doing something that I wasn't supposed to do, being sneaky, trying to be too grown. And, also I invited him in. Right. So, we hear that all the time where women are kind of blamed for, even if they initiate or have a discussion with the man. So, also, Jen, I want to tell you, thank you for sharing that story. Sometimes stories are not easy to share, but I think that if people are comfortable, the more transparent that we are can help somebody else, right? Kind of help out with something that they may be going through in their life. So I want to talk a little bit more about the religious aspect and the cultural aspect, and just how that also adds so much thoughts, into our brain of our responsibility as women, right? And how we are supposed to act as a woman to not allow certain things to happen in our life. Being paid. I know you said, you were, in the evangelical church and, witnessed a lot of things. And even in regards to what you heard about the young lady that just got victimized, that was what, like 2 weeks ago? Am I correct?
About a week ago.
About a week ago? Okay. And even the responses right now in 2020 that people respond and say, what does she have on? Or, why was she really at church? It's like, well, she probably was at church. That's the reason why y'all was at church. It's like these questions that people come up with. How do you think that we could, change this within the church, or any of you guys? Like, how can we change this mindset? Because even when you read the religious books, right? I've read all of them. You read them, women are always held at such a different standard throughout the books. So it's study that a woman's place is here, a man's place is there, and they really shouldn't intertwine on some levels, right? So how can we change that mindset if it's being ingrained in the very books that people study, right? I mean, like how do we do that? I just
Yeah, well, I can't speak for other religions, but I will say in regards to Christianity, or or some people call them being, Jesus followers. One thing that I feel that could really help people is if they look at the history of how these holy books were put together. And we can go into debates about how inspired they were and how convoluted they were. But if you go into history, for instance, just in Christianity, the female disciples were taken out of the text. So, automatically when you have a whole holy book that's, like even in the book of Proverbs where it says, don't be foolish like a woman, or comparing stupidity to women, or like being a woman to being a trap or whatever, to understand that, they were speaking from their perspective in a patriarchal society, years and years and years ago. And go into the history of, okay, who are these women that were leaders, not only in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament? Who are these leaders that followed around Jesus, and why were their books taken out, and what's the history behind that? And then elevating that place of women within the religion, within the spiritual walk, I think could be really, really helpful.
Yeah. No, I can dig that. I hear what you're processing. Yeah, go ahead, Jen, please. Yeah.
How do you do that though when the men write the book?
Yeah, well, see, that's the thing, like the for instance, the Bible that the canonized Bible that we know that most people know right now, obviously that was put together by by the Council of Cornelius years and years ago. But a lot of people are starting to research, okay, wow, how was that put together? And they're starting to see, oh, wait, there were whole books that were written by women that were taken out. And of course, there are going to be people that say, well, they were taken out for a reason, so that can't be for God. But, he who has an ear will hear that, okay, wait a second, there seems to be more to the story than what we were presented with. And even if they don't want to explore those other books, but to understand that, okay, these texts were written, they were written through men who had their own patriarchal views and who lived in a society where women were not valued. So how do we need to learn how to reframe that, in a fair sense, and to remember that we're all children of God, that we are created equal. Just like, for instance, what we're saying right now with, Black Lives Matter and that whole movement that's going on, also as women and men, that there is not this so-called hierarchy that you believe or that you want to believe. And if you want to follow that path, fine, but do it in a way where it's not where it's permissible for men to victimize women. Yeah. So, and it's a journey, because some people they don't want to hear that. They feel that it's almost blasphemy if you say something like that. But yeah, it's definitely a journey.
Yes, I've definitely been accused of that. Go ahead, Jennifer. No, please.
Sure.
No.
I was just gonna say there are, there's a new sense in some religious traditions, and I can speak, from the perspective of Christianity, in that, there are denominations that are beginning to reframe, to look through the scripture and actually realize how important women are throughout. So it seems like even though men did write the books, I saw that because men wrote the books, yep. However, if you're a person of faith, then I would say you would see that God kept having a different plan, right? Like he keeps putting these women in there while the men are trying to be like, no. And, I like to point out, I've heard several people in recent years pointing out, the first apostles were women, and they were the only ones there at the tomb, right? So, but even some investigation into these texts and Paul, the apostle Paul, was kind of misogynistic. However, he still goes to Philippi and has to uphold Lydia as a leader of the church. And so these things get downplayed on Sunday mornings, and maybe that's a way forward, is to start saying, no, I want some preaching on those texts too.
Is change the conversation, because I know, and so I know I spoke about, even with women getting pregnant at early, ages, and having to have such a a shameful walk that they take, within the church. And I just want to just put this out there too, that this is not bashing religion or bashing different people's religions at all. This is just being honest and transparent, because it's a real, and I know for myself that there is a burden that comes along with that when you are in a religious walk, on a religious walk, that you feel so accountable for the things that you do. You feel like you're the reason why, because this stuff is put into your brain. And so I like that we're talking about it, and I think it's important. And again, I don't need anybody getting upset about me talking about this, but I'm a very transparent person. And I lived it. I remember being pregnant at 16. I remember that, being pregnant in the church at 16. And I remember not wanting to tell anybody because I was so afraid, because I wasn't married, of course. So I, having this mindset put, that has been put into your brain since you were little. So I was afraid. And I remember when some people found out, I was taking off the children's usher board and out the choir. And at that time, those were things that were really dear to me, right? I was really attached to that, because growing up in my household, we went to church all the time. Like, I don't know if you guys know Southern, but I mean, you go all the time. You are at church all the time. So that was like a piece of my fabric. I mean, that was me. So that's how I identified when I was younger. So when that's all and then they just strip it away, right? Because of a choice that you made, it's damaging. People don't understand that. It's very damaging. You get taken off of things and people start to whisper around, and you're a child, right? I was still 16, so I just remember that being so hurtful. And I remember that being one of the first hurts I've ever experienced in my life, was because of this type of mindset that we're talking about right now. So I think it's important for people to talk about it. So if people get offended, I apologize that you are offended, but this is what we're going to talk about today, because I think it's important, because we need to help change the narrative and the conversation. So Jen, did you have more to, Jennifer, did you have more to say? I thought did you have more to say on that? I'm sorry.
No, I think that, we could talk about how, these purity cultures within religious traditions, have a very negative impact. It has a deep impact on reporting what happens to you. And, I think it's become quite clear the depth and breadth of the Catholic Church issue with molesting boys, and that has become an extremely important conversation. And I don't think we often talk very much about the fact that men and boys do suffer sexual assault as well as women, but again, it's usually about something related to power. And I think that, sadly, and I don't have the full info at my fingertips, but if a couple of years back, there was reporting that evangelical churches, and I want to say it was part of the Baptist tradition, and I'm sorry if I'm calling out the wrong tradition, but there was just as much of a proliferation of sexual assault of young women, and they were doing the same thing the Catholic Church was doing, was knowing that it was happening and then moving the pastors to other churches, and so they were not held accountable. But nobody knows this story. Like, we know about the Catholic situation, and we don't really know about this evangelical situation in America. And I can't help but say, is it because we value the lives of those young men and the trauma they suffered more than we value the lives of the women, and empathize with the trauma that the women suffered?
No, that's a good point. And this goes way across religion, of course, because I brought up religion, but this is in a lot of cultures, a lot of families, a lot of, people, it happens all the time, where people are victimized sexually. And again, it goes back to what you said, Jennifer. It's about power. And I'm glad that you mentioned about, the boys, because I did try to get, every time I do these type of discussion or have these type of discussions, I ask a male to come on, and it's so hard, and I get it. So I'm not saying that in negative. I'm just saying an observation that it is very hard to get men to speak on it, because they have been plagued with such a responsibility of being these tough you know, strong, whatever. And, you know, so if something like that is to happen to them, they can't talk about it because they look weak, or they look, you know, not manly enough, or whatever, all the stuff that we pass down to people. So I really think it is important to highlight that men and boys experience this quite often as well. And maybe Jen, maybe you could talk about that. I mean, being a prosecutor, and, you know, sex crimes, do you see a lot of men that come forward and say that they too have been, you know, assaulted?
We see more and more. When I first started prosecuting cases in the mid 90s, I'm just rolling through my cases in my head, and it takes probably 4 or 5 years before I even see one male victim.
Yeah.
But right now on my caseload, I have 10 or 15.
Okay.
So I think that, you know, the Me Too movement actually buoyed everyone, which is beautiful. I mean, I think people began to feel comfortable talking about their own story. And it's been helpful in many ways. It's been helpful because, you know, people do speak, people do come forward. On the other hand, there's been a huge backlash for, you know, and I remember talking to one of my closest colleagues when Me Too first happened, and she said to me, Jen, do you think this is going to help us or hurt us? And we both agreed, we're going to get a rush of people who report, which is so, so important, but we're also going to get a huge just door slamming in our face of, we're tired of hearing your stories. You know, we got to go back to it was where men were in power. And you didn't talk about this stuff.
So okay, so now you are seeing more men come forward. Is it and I guess I want to know, like, is it more grown men? Is it boys? Is it you know, or like, you know, families bringing their boys in of being violated, or is it more so men?
What I see more than anything else with crimes against men or boys is that same thing we see with women, that we see, you know, years of delay in reporting and years of self-blame and years of not reaching out for the help that you need. And, you know, that troop leader or that church leader or that teacher or that person who had access to you for whatever reason, the uncle or the long-term, you know, stepdad or whoever, you know, and they don't talk about it because really for many years, no one talked about anything about these things, you know, but they're coming forward now. And so a lot of my cases that I have right now that are active happened a long time ago. But the door has been open to prosecute those older cases, and we take them very seriously. We even if they happened a long time ago, as long as the statute of limitations hasn't run, we'll see if we can't get that together and try it.
So, and I know for Jen and Jennifer, I know you guys as being the historian and then being the lawyer, we see that this happens quite a bit within families, and even Bimpe, as you talked about, you know, within the cultural aspect of it, we see it a lot within families. How can we help girls and boys to come forward to speak up when it's in the family? Because, you know, I think about even when you talked about being paid in regards to the hugs and forcing that hug, or, you know, go over and kiss auntie. You know, I know growing up in my, you know, it was like this where you are forced to kind of embrace a person or, you know, sit next to a person. And I just think about how many people have been, you know, put in situations where they weren't comfortable as children, but we don't see it because that's just Auntie, you know, Carol, or that's just Uncle Bob. Uncle Bob, I don't know why. Well, Uncle Bob, you know, and Uncle Bob is, you know, Uncle Bob to us, but Uncle Bob has repeatedly maybe touched his child, or, you know, did some inappropriate things to make them feel uncomfortable. How can we combat this? How can we change this? Because, you know, within the families is so, you know, in the face, but we won't talk about it in families, right? We won't address it. We won't, you know, acknowledge it sometimes. What can we do? You know, sometimes I feel so helpless.
Well, and I think from my perspective of, you know, dealing with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of victims, they all want the same thing. They want somebody to listen to them, to believe them, and to help them.
Yeah.
You know? And so that's really all it takes is listen. You know, make yourself a person. I mean, I can't imagine that you wouldn't be a person who people would approach, you know. Make yourself available to people because they probably can't tell that story at home, but they'll try to find a safe place to tell it. And if it's a teacher or a Sunday school teacher or just another friend. There's a safe space coming that will help them to say the words. And then what you have to do as a person who hears these words, and I hear them all the time, but those who don't, you have to be the person who says, thank you for telling me that. Thank you for sharing it with me. How can I help you?
Right.
Let them have control over their narrative.
Yeah.
And it's all about, one of the most important questions I ever learned to ask was, help me understand, and then X, Y, or Z, help me understand that. Help me understand. Because people will keep talking in their own words and in their own way if you don't inject yourself in the narrative.
That's true. Help me understand how I can help you. Help me understand what happened to you. Help me understand what you were feeling. I get that totally. And make them, like you said, feel comfortable to share it with you. And thankfully, I've always had good relationships with people where they did feel comfortable sharing. And with that, I don't mind sharing my own story, so they can feel like you are not alone. I've had things happen to me in different situations. So Jennifer, what do you feel we can do? I mean, it's just as you studied, I mean, it's happened since the beginning of time, and I think things are changing. They are changing, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I think that when we're teaching, I think we need to take more care in introducing these stories so that we start to normalize having the conversations and that it is part of our history, and that can be empowering for some to hear that they're not alone. They're part of a bigger human story. I think that it can be important for us all to realize the use of sexual assault and rape throughout history as a means of control. And we don't, and it's one thing to just say that and like take it in, but I think when you hear the stories and you hear how it's been something through time, I know Erin, you and I talked before about like the connection between rape and war. And when we teach wars in schools, we never mention that part. And I think that that's something that needs to happen. I mean, there's a deep connection between rape and genocide when we look at something like the Holocaust or Rwanda. Or even in the Japanese invasion of China and occupation of China during World War II, which actually began in 1932. And even more, I'm just going to share one story with you because it's devastating and people don't know this. But for December 13th, 1937, Japanese began a 6-week-long massacre that destroyed the Chinese city of Nanking. Along the way, the soldiers raped an estimated 20 to 80,000 Chinese women.
Wow.
The world was outraged, and the Emperor Hirohito's response was to institute more comfort stations, which were euphemistic brothels. And those were, they were kidnapping women from Korea and forcing them into a sexual slavery. And those women, they were called comfort women. They're 90% of the Korean women who were kidnapped and forced into sexual slavery, who were so brutalized, 90% didn't survive their treatment.
Oh, gracious.
The ones that did survive and did manage to return to Korea were so ostracized by the community that many of them committed suicide.
Oh, wow.
So the story of the comfort women is still, it still causes deep tension between Korea and Japan. So much so that a few years back when San Francisco erected a memorial for the comfort women, it almost caused an international incident. Because, so these stories, they're not just stories from the past. They still deeply impact who we are today. And there's not really a war that there's not also a rape story. And I think that we have to start being honest about what war actually looks like. We have to be honest about what slavery actually looked like. We don't need to still tell happy stories about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. He raped her. Like, she had his kids because he raped her. It doesn't mean that the words he wrote in the Declaration are not great words. They are great. That's cool. But he still was a rapist. And we shouldn't separate those things. So I don't want to ramble on too long, but I appreciate it. We have to confront the hard truths of our past and normalize talking about what really happened and how that was a tool of domination.
Yes. No, I appreciate that. And that goes back to the transparency. And that's the only way for us to be accountable for our actions today. And what we teach today is to be honest of what was taught before, and what happened before. So I appreciate you for sharing that. Being Paid, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, when it comes to regards of abuse that happens within family units, that's a tricky one. I'm sure Jen can testify to that. It's a very tricky one. And then on top of that, if it happens within a church, which is also sort of like a family, because I've heard horror stories about women coming forward towards someone in their family or someone in their family who happens to be a pastor and just being ostracized by their family. So it's important to let those people know that they're not alone and that there is a family outside waiting for them that will that will take care of them. Because it's hard. It's very difficult when everyone wants to protect Uncle Bob or Sally or Pastor Eric,
or Pastor Bob. Exactly. Yeah.
It's very difficult. But just to let to have the resources in place to let them know you are not alone and there is family outside of this toxic unit or organization that you've been a part of.
Right.
And it always strikes me, given that we know what women go through when they come forward, and men too, given that we know they're ostracized from family and friends. If they're reporting within their church, they're going to lose their church family. They're going to lose all kinds of support that they have on a regular basis. Given that is how it is, even now in 2020, doesn't that tell you that they're not lying?
Right.
It's like a magical thing to think about, but if all that you have to overcome, that mountain you have to climb just to say these words that this is what happened to me, and then have an attorney stand next to you and go through a preliminary examination and go through a trial, and your story has to be exactly the same or else you're lying. All the things that you go through, it's every time. By the time I'm standing in trial, I'm not standing next to people who aren't telling me the truth.
Right. And it's got to be exhausting. I mean, just exhausting, heartbreaking, to have to prove that a person, and it's the way they make her prove it. It's the way they make you prove it for her. It's so despicable, so horrible, so the way they make her out to be just so criminal and so gross. And so, I mean, it just breaks my heart. And we have someone here who spoke love. She said, there's a lot of women like herself that haven't found anybody to talk to, and you just kind of learn to live through it. And I think that's probably a lot of people echo that same sentiment that, they just had to kind of deal with it, because especially if it's, and I'm not saying her, I'm saying in general, if it's within the family dynamics, or if it's, somebody that lives down the street that everybody, because I know people who have taken advantage of young people who were pillars in the community. If you were to say that this person did that, they will say, oh my goodness, not him.
No way. Right.
Yeah, and especially when we talk about within different cultural aspects or religious aspects, like you said, it goes back to that whole burden of, well, I don't want to make the pastor look bad. I don't want to make this person look bad. And so you have this heavy burden that we should not put on the person that has been abused and that has been victimized. So, I appreciate Love for saying that too, because it's important. People just have to people just live through it. And they shouldn't have to feel that way, that they can't talk to somebody or go to somebody to get help and heal, because sometimes you don't fully heal. You just kind of cope.
Right.
And we need to allow people to be able to heal from that. So,
I think that there's another piece that we haven't addressed yet that we should. And that is that, especially within families, that there's an economic piece to it too, that if this person is your sole support for your children, or if this person is your sole support for yourself, or you have no money in your own name and no credit card in your own name and no nothing in your own name because you're in a power and control relationship to begin with, you're much more likely to just find your way through it than you are to leave.
Yeah.
And that happens with domestic violence, but it happens with sexual assault as well. The people who carry that burden in the most stunning way are the children. You know, when a child is being abused, they know, they take full responsibility for the way that their reporting will blow their family up. And so many children don't say a word, but the ones who do, more often than I can even count, do it because they were abused for a number of years, but there's a younger sibling.
Yes.
And that abuser is now starting to look at that younger sibling the way that they looked at them. And so even though they couldn't stand up for themselves,
yes,
and blow up their family, they'll blow it up to save the other one.
Yeah, wow.
And that is just heartbreaking. And I see it several times a year.
Oh, I'm sure. That is heartbreaking. It's so sad, but you know, and you're speaking to that power, that resilience that comes through and says, you know what, I couldn't save myself, right, but I'm not gonna let you do it and destroy, because they know what it feels like. They know that pain. They know that trauma. Right. And wow, it's just so much. It's such a heavy topic, but it's such a necessary topic. It's so necessary to talk about it because, again, people need those outlets. People need to know that people believe them, that people are there, that we are a community within ourselves of people who have either, you know, experienced it or sat beside someone else who has experienced it and watched them cry and talk them through it. We all are in this together, and we have to really help each other out, because it's just, you know, for me, it's hard when I see women, but when I see a child, you know, who has been broken, literally broken, because they have been victimized that way, it's just, the feeling I have is just, I can't even describe it, because I have rage, I have anger, I have just sadness. And then I have, okay, what can I do for this person? And again, Jen, like you said, you know, when it comes to the economic part of it, you know, I mean, it's a lot to that, when especially if their abuser is saying, you better not say nothing, or I'm gonna kick you know, your mom and you guys out. You know, you can't live here with me anymore if you say something, or I'm gonna hurt your mother, or, you know, or vice versa. I mean, women do it too. So I'm not just putting this on the men. I'm just saying that, you know, a lot of instances that I've talked to people about, it's been a lot of women, you know, who were afraid to leave. And some of the women, Jen, I'm sure you can attest to this, you know, sometimes the mothers know that the father is doing it to the child, or the uncle is doing it to the child, but they're afraid too, you know, because they get threatened, or they're afraid they can't take care of themselves. So they know that's their only source of income. So what will I do? You know?
Right. And I've seen mothers who basically, you know, made the choice to sort of sacrifice the one child that was being assaulted because the other kids needed the money and the economic support, and, you know, the guy to go with them to baseball practice. And, you know, I've seen those choices. And I mean, we all make horrible, difficult choices every day. And I think the most important thing that we as a community can do is just to not be judgmental, you know. Yes. And I try to train my juries from the beginning of that too, that, you know, you're not here to judge the victim.
Right.
You know, or her actions, or what she did or didn't do, or what her mother did or didn't do, or what her father did or didn't do, or what her best friend knew but didn't tell. You know, that's not what we're judging here.
Right.
And those are the facts of the case, and we'll tell you about those, but we're judging what he did. You know, let's keep it over here where it belongs.
Exactly. It's just so sad that we still have to do that. I mean, Jennifer, I know you spoke earlier about how, you know, the women were considered property, or, you know, the way, you know, the property was damaged. So it's kind of like, you know.
Yeah, it wasn't, I mean, it wasn't, well, for the first time, rape was actually considered ever a crime against a woman as a person, not until the 12th century. Up until then, it was always a property crime against the male head figure in her life, her father or her husband. But
and
that
you could
carried
get some sheep, or
right,
know, a little bit of money.
Yeah, there was there was a
Right.
calculation about like the agricultural goods you were going to get for that. And it carried, but that legacy carried through, even though we started having laws and prosecution that treated it as a crime against the woman, there was still a lot of sense of that connection to this woman not being fully autonomous to herself. And the damaged person was her husband or her father or some, that male figure in her life, not herself. So in that sense, we've come a long way in looking at the woman and her trauma and who she is and what she needs. And like we were saying, we're not there yet. We're not doing the best job yet, but
it's better.
We've come farther than you're worth two goats and a sheep,
Right.
So
oh my goodness. It's like you almost have to laugh to keep from crying, because it's astonishing that you even have to say this, that we even have to have this conversation. I just think back, when I know I spoke on this a little bit earlier, but just with like the female mutilation, that happens to their private area, and then the idea of, in some cultures where, the man will have sex with the woman, the night of their wedding, and if she doesn't bleed properly or something, then she's not worthy of him, and she can be, kind of, in some cultures she's killed. She loses her life because her blood didn't flow out the right way, or and I just think about, I watched a documentary some years ago when they do the female mutilation, and how they cut parts and take things out, and then they sew back up, so it's this small little hole just enough for urine to come out. Right. And then when he's ready, when she gets married or what have you, then he's able to just penetrate that, and the pain that must go along with that. Yeah, I mean, as women, we know the pain that can go along with just being deflowered in normal, sexual activities, but let alone to be your private areas to be manipulated, and then torn into, and then, in hopes and the stress that could be with that, that hopefully it bleeds right, or hopefully he feels like, he penetrated properly to feel like a man, or I could lose my life. I mean, it's just astonishing that this is still a conversation in some cultures and some some parts of the world. So I really thank you guys. I know we've gone over time, but this is such a big topic for me, and I'm so passionate about it. So I appreciate you guys for taking the time to have this conversation, because I really want people to know, whoever's listening out there and whoever will listen, that talk to somebody if you need to. Whoever, I don't care if it's the little lady that helps you cross the street or what have you, or somebody. Talk to whoever you feel safe talking to, because this is important. And it helps. We need to help change the narrative. So you guys are doing that. I appreciate, Jen, the work that you're doing in the court system to assist with families, women, men, children, to get their voices heard, because it's important. They need that advocate. They need someone to do that. Jennifer, the studies that you do to be able to, help bring awareness, because it's things that you just taught me this evening that I didn't know. So I appreciate that. Bimpe, your experience and sharing your experiences is so important, because I think we need to be more transparent with each other, more open with each other, especially as women, and not be so judgmental of each other for what has been inflicted upon us. We have to stop doing that, so thank you guys so much. I just want, if you like to say some parting words, so to speak, in regards to this topic. Jennifer, I'm going to let you go first. Do you have anything that you want to share before we end?
I would just say we have to continue to advocate that we have to tell the hard parts of our history as much as we like celebrating the good parts. I think that it's hard. It's hard to look back through history and see that we're still having some of the same problems, but I do want to just leave an empowering note of we are doing better. We are advocating more for ourselves and for each other, and it is changing, and there is a difference that we can see over time.
A glimmer of hope. Thank you for that. Jen, did you have anything that you wanted to kind of leave us, with?
Well, I would just reiterate that what people need the most is to be heard and believed. And it's so important to hear, listen, truly listen and believe. It's not your job to pick it apart. It's not your job to cross-examine. It's not your job to ask questions about, why they did things the way that they did it. If they're coming to you with something that they really had struggled for a long time, probably to tell anybody, your butt down and listen to what they have to say.
Yeah.
They need to be heard.
Yes, I agree. Thank you. Beanpay, did you have anything that you would like to leave us with?
Well, I just want to thank all of you because I myself learned so much today, especially Jennifer, when you were going over the historical parts, and then Jen, your knowledge with being in the courtroom. And I would just want to say that it may be scary to some people to be a forerunner in their religious sect or in their culture to kind of be on the forefront of forming new mindsets, but it's worth it. And somebody's got to stand up and stand out and kind of break away from the norm in order to have a more peaceful world and to have women be able to live in that equality and not live in fear of being assaulted and of having to stay quiet when they have been violated. So.
Yes, and that's where we come in, right? When that person comes out and says something, that's where we, as the village, come in and say, okay, I'm gonna wrap my arms around you and stand with you as you tell your story. And that's where we need to, a good takeaway is that we have to wrap our arms around each other. And as you said, Jen, hear, listen, believe, and fight for them. We can do that. We can use our voices and our platform. So again, thank you so much. I could talk about this all day because it is I myself have dealt with different things in different aspects in my life. So it's personal to me. And I feel like, people going through any type of violent relationship or a violent scenario or, different thing in life, we have to believe them. We have to hear them. We have to support them. It's really important. So this is really close to me. So thank you guys again for taking your time. Jen, keep doing that work.
Absolutely. Every day until I die.
I think that's incredible. And, Beanpay, you too. Just keep spreading that knowledge that you have. And Jennifer, thank you so much for what you share because people need to know the history. People need to know that this has been going on. So I think sometimes it'll kind of trigger something like, wow, this has been going on that long. Maybe we need to really do something about it. And that's in a lot of different aspects, So anyway, you guys have a great evening. Thanks again. And we're going to help people to stop asking that question, but what was she wearing, right?
Amen.
Yes. Well, you guys have a great night. I love you all. Thanks so much for your time. You guys have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.